In the shadowed dawn of the Second World War, as Europe braced itself for another catastrophic conflict, a dark force began to stir with terrifying momentum. From the ashes of its defeat in the First World War, Germany had risen, not merely as a nation seeking redemption, but as a military behemoth, wielding a terrifying new power, technology. This was not the Germany of 1918. This was a new, radicalized empire driven by ideology, vengeance, and an insatiable hunger for domination. At its helm stood Adolf Hitler, a man whose twisted vision for the future was matched only by the ruthless efficiency of those who brought it to life through machines, science, and steel. As the world watched in disbelief, the Wehrmacht swept across borders with unprecedented speed. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in mere months. And behind these lightning victories lay a terrifying truth. Germany had not just rearmed. It had re-engineered warfare itself. Gone were the days of trench warfare and bayonet charges. The battlefields of World War II were dominated by innovation, by aircraft that could break the sound barrier of fear, tanks that crushed defenses with surgical precision, rockets that roared into the skies with the promise of destruction, and submarines that stalked the oceans like steel sharks. Germany's enemies were not just facing soldiers. They were facing scientists in uniform, engineers of chaos, and commanders who fused traditional tactics with groundbreaking inventions. From the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, to the V-2 rocket that brought terror to the skies of London. The Third Reich's war machine was built not only on ideology, but on the shoulders of genius and the misuse of scientific brilliance. Laboratories became battlegrounds. Blueprints became weapons. And in the minds of Nazi leaders, technological supremacy was more than a strategic advantage. It was a pathway to immortality. But beneath the gleaming surface of German efficiency and innovation lay a sinister truth. Much of this progress came at a horrifying cost. Forced labor, human experimentation, and the exploitation of conquered peoples fueled the Reich's technological advances. This was a war not only for territory, but for the very soul of science. What drove this obsession with innovation? How did Germany leap ahead in so many fields of warfare? And what secrets still remain buried in the ruins of its underground bunkers, its research labs, and its shattered cities? This is the story of the Third Reich's most powerful and dangerous legacy, its science and technology. A tale of ambition and arrogance, of brilliance corrupted by ideology, and of how the race to dominate the battlefield reshaped our world forever. While the world braced for the familiar rhythm of dogfights and propellers hidden within the guarded airfields of Nazi Germany, something extraordinary was taking shape, something that defied the very physics of war as the world knew it. It looked like a fighter plane, sleek and deadly, but with no spinning propeller at its nose. Instead, twin engines clung to its wings like clenched fists of thunder. When it screamed through the sky, it did not sound like any aircraft before it. It did not roar, it howled, tearing the air apart at over 500 miles per hour. Its name was the Messerschmitt Me-262, and it was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter. To understand what this machine meant to the war and to the men who fought it, we have to go back not to the front lines, but to the minds behind the machine. In the early 1930s, as nations debated over treaties and sanctions, a quiet revolution in aeronautical engineering was underway in Germany. At its heart was Dr. Willy Messerschmitt, a brilliant but controversial designer whose obsession with speed would soon align perfectly with Hitler's hunger for domination. Messerschmitt had long envisioned a new kind of aircraft, one that would no longer be bound by the limitations of propeller-driven engines. With the support of the Luftwaffe's High Command and the increasingly powerful Ministry of Aviation, development of a radical new fighter began in secret. But here's the twist. Although the Me-262 would ultimately become a terrifying weapon, Its story is riddled with delays, missed opportunities, and political interference that likely saved thousands of Allied lives. The Me-262 made its first successful test flight in July 1942, a full year before Allied planners even conceived of countering such a threat. At that time, the war was still teetering. Germany was overextended, but not yet cornered. Had the jet entered service then, with full-scale production and deployment, the skies over Europe might have become a killing field for Allied bombers. Yet history had other plans. Despite its clear superiority, the Me-262 languished in limbo for nearly 2 years. Part of the delay came from technical challenges. Germany was pioneering an entirely new form of propulsion, one that pushed materials, metallurgy, and mechanics to their absolute limit. Jet engines were notoriously temperamental. They overheated, they tore themselves apart, and they demanded a level of precision that few factories, especially those already under Allied bombing pressure, could consistently maintain. But, perhaps more significantly, the Me-262 fell victim to internal power struggles within the Nazi regime. Hitler, in one of his more fateful interventions, insisted the jet be redesigned not as a fighter, but as a blitz bomber, a fast, light bomber that could strike Allied targets with devastating speed. This decision not only compromised the design, but delayed production and deployment by over a year. The aircraft that could have crippled Allied bombing raids over Germany was instead diverted into a role it was never meant to fill. Even as engineers scrambled to meet shifting demands, Allied bombing campaigns intensified. The very factories that produced the Me-262's delicate jet engines, such as those run by BMW and Junkers, became prime targets. Skilled labor was in short supply, and much of the assembly work fell to prisoners and forced laborers in underground facilities like Dachau and Mauthausen. Where innovation was built on suffering, the machine that could have changed the course of the war was being built by hands that were themselves victims of it. By the time the Me-262 finally entered operational service in August 1944, the tide had already turned. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Red Army was advancing from the east. The skies were thick with American B-17s and British Lancasters. Germany was bleeding, desperate, and outnumbered. And yet even then, the Me-262 stunned its enemies. Allied pilots described the first encounters with these jet fighters as something out of science fiction. They were faster, climbed higher, and struck harder than anything the Allies had. Conventional tactics failed. Some pilots tried ambushes during takeoff and landing. Others simply ran. One American squadron leader reportedly radioed, "If you see one, dive for the deck and hope it runs out of fuel chasing you." And often it did. The Me-262's biggest weakness was not its combat capability. It was logistics. Jet engines guzzled fuel at an alarming rate. Spare parts were rare, and the Luftwaffe could no longer protect its shrinking airfields. Pilots, often hastily trained, faced overwhelming odds in the air. For every kill, the Me-262 suffered losses it could no longer afford. Still, it left a mark. In less than a year, the Me-262 shot down over 500 Allied aircraft. It turned young German pilots into legends and sometimes into martyrs. It represented the last flicker of hope for a crumbling Reich, a ghost of what might have been, if politics, ego, and desperation had not stood in the way of science. And perhaps more importantly, it rewrote the future. After the war, the Allies were quick to gather German scientists, blueprints, and surviving aircraft. The United States and the Soviet Union both incorporated German jet technology into their post-war aviation programs. Within a decade, jets were standard in every major air force on Earth. The Cold War began in the slipstream of the Me-262. So what does it all mean? The Me-262 was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of lost potential, of terrifying brilliance, and of the dangerous union between science and ideology. It reminds us that innovation without ethics, and genius without restraint, can give rise to monsters that fly not just through the skies but through history. Just as the Me-262 roared through the skies, shattering the boundaries of speed and air combat, another creation of the Third Reich was preparing to tear through an entirely different frontier, not the skies, but the very heavens. Deep within the forests of northern Germany, under the shadow of secrecy and the haze of war, a team of engineers was crafting something the world had never seen. A missile that could strike from beyond the clouds, faster than sound, impossible to intercept, and terrifyingly precise. It would not be launched from a bomber, nor dropped from a plane. It would rise vertically, like a spear hurled from Earth itself. It was called the V-2 rocket Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2, and it was as much a declaration of desperation as it was a triumph of engineering. The man behind this technological leap was Wernher von Braun, a visionary scientist whose boyhood fascination with space would one day lead him to build the Saturn V rocket that carried man to the moon. But before he reached for the stars, he would help bring ruin to the cities of Europe. In the early 1940s, von Braun and his team at the Peenemünde Army Research Center began work on a weapon, unlike any before. Germany, reeling from relentless Allied bombing raids, wanted a way to strike back not with bombers that could be shot down, but with something silent, swift, and unstoppable. The result was the Aggregate 4, later renamed the V-2. Standing over 14 meters tall, powered by a liquid-fueled engine, and capable of traveling at over 5,000 kilometers per hour. It was the first true ballistic missile. When it was launched, it left a pillar of flame and smoke, climbing into the stratosphere before arcing back down toward its target at supersonic speeds. Unlike earlier buzz bombs like the V-1, the V-2 made no sound as it approached, no sirens, no warnings. The only sign it had arrived was the explosion. On October 3, 1942, the first successful test flight was completed. For the Nazis, it was a moment of triumph. For the Allies, who had no knowledge of it yet, it was the quiet beginning of a new kind of warfare. 2 years later, on September 8, 1944, the V-2 made its combat debut, slamming into London with a force of over a ton of explosives. Panic spread. Unlike conventional air raids, there was no defense against the V-2, no fighters to intercept, no flak to fire. It came from nowhere, and it killed indiscriminately. But this story is not one of sheer technological glory. Behind every rocket that launched, there was a cost, and a human one. The V-2 program relied heavily on forced labor, including thousands of prisoners from concentration camps like Dora Mittelbau, who worked under brutal conditions in underground factories carved into mountains. Malnutrition, beatings, and executions were common. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by the weapon itself. It is here that the moral paradox of the V-2 becomes clearest, a marvel of science, powered by suffering. And yet, despite its horrific origins, the V-2 redefined modern warfare. For the first time in history, a nation had the power to strike another not through air superiority or sea dominance, but by reaching directly into its cities from hundreds of miles away. The age of missile warfare had begun, and even in its failures, the V-2 laid the groundwork for what would come next. Technically, the V-2 was both brilliant and flawed. While its speed and range were unprecedented, its accuracy was poor, missing targets by hundreds of meters. Its cost was astronomical, draining resources Germany could ill afford. For every successful launch, several more misfired or exploded. Still, over 3,000 volts, twos were launched before the end of the war, striking not only London, but also Antwerp, Paris, and other European cities. The psychological impact was immense. Citizens lived in fear not of bombers overhead, but of the silent death that could fall from the sky at any moment. Meanwhile, the Allies scrambled to understand and counter this new threat. British intelligence, aided by resistance movements and aerial reconnaissance, eventually pinpointed Peenemünde and launched a devastating bombing raid in 1943. It slowed production, but did not stop it. By then, the V-2 had become Hitler's last hope of revenge, a way to punish his enemies, even as the war turned against him. He believed the V-weapons could reverse the course of history. In truth, they only postponed the inevitable. As Nazi Germany crumbled, the Allies raced to capture German scientists and technology before the Soviets could. This effort, known as Operation Paperclip, brought von Braun and many of his team to the United States. There, the same mind that built the V-2 for Hitler would go on to lead NASA's Apollo program. The dark legacy of the V-2 had crossed the ocean and shifted from warfare to exploration. The irony is striking. The missile that once rained terror on London would eventually become the ancestor of the rocket that launched mankind to the moon. The blueprints for destruction were redrawn as blueprints for discovery. And the man who once stood beside the ruins of Allied cities would later stand beside astronauts, watching them leave Earth for the stars. But we cannot and should not divorce the technology from its origins. The V-2 rocket was born from a regime built on cruelty and conquest. Its brilliance is inseparable from the suffering it caused, and its story is a cautionary tale of what happens when science serves tyranny. In the arc of its flight, from the launch pads of Peenemünde to the craters of London, and finally to the launch pads of Cape Canaveral, the V-2 reminds us that every advance carries a burden, and every leap forward leaves a shadow. Whether it is a weapon or a vehicle of exploration depends not on the machine, but on the hands and hearts of those who wield it. If the skies above Europe had become the proving ground for revolutionary flight, and the upper atmosphere echoed with the distant roar of the V-2 rocket, then the fields, forests, and cities beneath bore witness to a quieter but no less profound transformation, a shift in how war was fought, seen, and sensed, while the Allies relied on brute force and numbers. Nazi Germany was experimenting with something different, precision. Not merely to overwhelm, but to outthink, outsee, and outmaneuver their enemies through technology that felt decades ahead of its time. In a world still dominated by iron sights and carpet bombing, the Germans were already envisioning and, in some cases, deploying smart bombs, night vision, and advanced radar systems. This was warfare entering the realm of calculation and code, no longer ruled solely by strength, but by systems. It began in the air. On September 9, 1943, an Italian battleship, the Roma, steamed defiantly across the Mediterranean, newly liberated from Mussolini's grip and attempting to surrender to the Allies. But overhead, German bombers appeared not with conventional payloads, but with something far more sinister. A guided bomb, dropped from high altitude and then remotely steered toward its target with terrifying precision. This was the Fritz X, the world's first radio-guided smart bomb, a 3,000-pound explosive equipped with stabilizing fins and control surfaces, adjusted in mid-flight by an operator watching from the aircraft above. Moments later, a direct hit tore through the Roma's armored hull. The ship split apart. Over 1,000 sailors perished in minutes. The weapon had not merely struck, it had selected, targeted, and destroyed. And in that moment, the idea of precision bombing was no longer a dream, it was reality. The Fritz X was only one of several early guided munitions Germany developed. Others, like the HS-293 glide bomb, were similarly remote-controlled, using joystick-style systems linked via radio signals. These devices were crude by today's standards, but in 1943 they represented an unimaginable leap, a glimpse of the future in the midst of the most brutal war the world had known. But what made such targeting possible, it was not just bombs that were getting smarter, it was the battlefield itself. In bunkers and radar towers along the French coast, rotating dishes silently swept the skies, hunting for intruders. This was the Würzburg radar, a dish-shaped apparatus that could track enemy bombers with astonishing accuracy. While British radar in 1940 had helped detect approaching Luftwaffe formations during the Battle of Britain, German radar evolved rapidly afterward, becoming more refined, more mobile, and capable of directing flak cannons and night fighters with chilling effectiveness. The Mammut radar, another German innovation, operated on the early principle of phased array systems, allowing for long-range detection of aircraft formations far before they reached the coastline. These radar networks were not just passive observers. They became active participants in the war, feeding real-time data to command centers and shaping tactical responses in ways no army had done before. But while radar kept watch from above, another German innovation gave soldiers on the ground an even more personal kind of edge, one that could turn the cover of night from a vulnerability into an advantage. Imagine this. It is 1944, the Eastern Front. A German infantryman waits silently in the blackness. His weapon, not just a Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first modern assault rifle, but one fitted with a bulky, boxy scope glowing faintly green. To the enemy, the night is a shield, but to him it is illuminated, exposed, vulnerable. He pulls the trigger before the Soviet patrol ever sees him. This was the ZG-1229 Vampire, the world's first night vision rifle scope, developed for use with infrared searchlights mounted on both rifles and vehicles. It was cumbersome, required a backpack-sized power unit, and only functioned at relatively close ranges, but it worked. While Allied troops stumbled through darkness, German forces could see, shoot, and survive. Even tanks like the Panther were experimented on with night vision capabilities in their final iterations. Though the technology never reached mass deployment due to supply shortages and the crumbling state of the Reich, it was enough to suggest a new kind of battlefield was coming, one where technology, not just tactics, would decide who saw first, who shot first, and who lived to tell the tale. The unifying thread through all these innovations was Germany's desperation for control. As the war dragged on and the front lines collapsed inward, Hitler and his generals pinned their hopes not on numbers, they were hopelessly outmatched, but on science. They believed that superior technology could tilt the scales, that precision could compensate for dwindling manpower and failing logistics. But there is a darker side to this pursuit. The very minds that created these wonders were often co-opted under coercion or ideology. Many worked in facilities powered by slave labor, where men and women were worked to death assembling delicate guidance systems or radar components. The Vampire, the Fritz X, the Würzburg, all bore the fingerprints of human suffering, of science, weaponized not just against the enemy, but against humanity itself. And yet history is rarely so simple as hero and villain, invention and atrocity. After the war, the same technologies that had guided bombs into battleships and lit up human silhouettes in the dark were quickly absorbed by both East and West. Radar became air traffic control. Infrared scopes became standard military issue. Precision bombs became the cornerstone of modern air campaigns. The dark seeds sown in the laboratories of the Third Reich would blossom twistedly into military-industrial miracles of the Cold War. For the Me-262, the V-2, and now these battlefield systems, the story is consistent. Nazi Germany, through a mix of ambition, ideology, and fear, birthed tools that were decades ahead of their time. Tools that, had they been deployed earlier or in greater numbers, might have changed the outcome of key battles or prolonged the war with even greater destruction. But they were not. Not fully. Not in time. And yet, they served as warnings of what happens when war becomes a laboratory, when men pursue precision not to prevent death, but to deliver it more efficiently. In the end, the legacy of these systems is not just in what they destroyed, but in what they revealed. That even in the darkest corners of history, innovation persists. That even in the shadow of atrocity, human ingenuity burns. And that in war, perhaps more than anywhere else, technology is never neutral. As the Me-262 streaked through the skies and the V-2 rockets fell like thunderbolts from the heavens, And while precision bombs and night vision scopes rewrote the rules of distance and darkness, there was still one domain where brute force met innovation face to face: the battlefield itself. And no symbol of Nazi Germany's armored might was more feared or more mythologized than the heavy steel beast that rumbled across Europe: the Panzer, the Tiger, and the Panther tanks. These were not just weapons of war. They were statements rolling declarations of power, dominance, and terrifying intent. They became the iron fist of blitzkrieg, and their legacy would echo across battlefields for generations. When Germany launched its campaign of conquest in 1939, it was not with the biggest tanks, nor even the strongest. Early Panzer models like the Panzer I and II were light, under-armored, and modestly armed. But what they lacked in raw power, they made up for in speed, coordination, and numbers. These vehicles formed the backbone of the German war machine in Poland, in France, and even during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. But make no mistake, they were just the beginning. Germany did not merely use tanks, it reimagined them. At the heart of this transformation was a general named Heinz Guderian, a man who understood that tanks were not meant to follow the infantry, they were meant to lead. His vision was blitzkrieg, fast-moving armor, supported by mechanized infantry and air power, striking deep behind enemy lines, disrupting communication, breaking morale. The tank was no longer a support unit. It was the spearhead. But as the war dragged on and Germany faced increasingly formidable enemies, this strategy demanded more than just speed. In the forests of France and the steppes of Russia, German tank crews began to face machines that could take a punch and deliver one right back. Most notably, the Soviet T-34 changed the game. Its sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful guns stunned the Germans in 1941. The Panzers were no longer enough. Germany needed something more. And so, from the drawing boards of German engineers emerged a new generation of tanks vehicles that would terrify Allied soldiers, haunt the battle reports of generals, and earn nicknames, whispered in foxholes. The first of these monsters was the Tiger I. Officially designated the Panzerkampfwagen 6, it weighed over 50 tons and was armed with the devastating 88 mm gun. Originally an anti-aircraft weapon that could punch through Allied armor at ranges where return fire was meaningless. Its armor was nearly impervious to frontal assault, and when it arrived on the battlefield in 1942, it was like a myth come to life. One tank, under the command of legendary ace Michael Wittmann, reportedly destroyed dozens of enemy vehicles in a single engagement, using not just firepower but precision, terrain, and speed. But the Tiger had flaws. It was heavy, so heavy, in fact, that many bridges could not support it. It broke down often, guzzled fuel like a dragon, and required a level of logistical support that Germany, especially late in the war, could no longer provide. So engineers tried again. They made it bigger, stronger. The result was the Tiger II, or Königstiger, the King Tiger. Even heavier, with thicker armor and a longer-barreled 88 mm gun, the King Tiger was a fortress on treads. It could destroy anything on the battlefield if it could get there. Mechanical problems plagued it. Its production was too slow. And, in the end, there were never enough of them to turn the tide. Yet between the Tigers came a tank that many would argue was Germany's true masterpiece, the Panther. Born from the harsh lessons of the Eastern Front, the Panther was designed to blend the best of both worlds: mobility and protection, firepower and agility. It borrowed the T-34's sloped armor concept and paired it with a powerful 75 mm high-velocity cannon. Unlike the Tigers, it was faster, easier to produce, and mechanically more reliable. It became the backbone of the German armored force from 1943 onward. Serving on all major fronts, Allied tankers feared it. German crews trusted it. And historians still debate whether it was the best tank of the war. There was one moment, though, when the Panther was not just powerful, it was deceptive. During the Battle of the Bulge, German forces disguised a number of Panther tanks to look like American M10 tank destroyers, hoping to sow confusion among retreating Allied forces. The ruse worked briefly, causing chaos before the deception was uncovered. But it proved one thing. Even in desperation, the German military still saw the Panther not just as a weapon, but as a tool of strategy. By the end of the war, Germany's tanks were no longer rolling across open fields in victory. They were fighting desperate rearguard actions, defending cities in ruins, ambushing Allied columns from wooded hills. But their impact both physically and psychologically remained profound. To Allied troops, encountering a Tiger or Panther was not just a tactical challenge. It was a moral one. It tested their courage, their resolve. And often, it forced them to fight smarter, not harder. After the war, the world took notice. Soviet and Western armored doctrines both evolved in the shadow of the Panther and Tiger. NATO tanks in the Cold War were designed with them in mind. Even today, many of the principles, sloped armor, high-velocity guns, combined arms tactics, trace back to those early lessons learned in the mud and fire of World War II. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Germany's armored beasts is not just their mechanical brilliance. It is the way they changed how we think about war itself. No longer just about numbers or bravery, the battlefield became a chessboard, and tanks became queens, fast, powerful, and decisive. In Germany's race to dominate the battlefield, it built machines that were ahead of their time. But no machine, no matter how strong, could overcome flawed strategy, overreach, and the overwhelming force of a united world determined to stop them. Still, the tracks they left behind are etched into history. Their steel carcasses may rust in museums and forests now, but their stories roll on reminders of a war where innovation met ambition, and where firepower became philosophy. It was not just the machines that stunned the world, it was how they moved. It was not just the tanks, the rockets, or the precision bombs that carved fear into enemy lines. It was the way they were, unleashed with shocking speed, overwhelming coordination, and unrelenting pressure. This was blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a term that would become infamous across Europe and forever redefine the nature of modern combat. And at the heart of it all stood a man with a mind wired not only for machinery, but for movement. Heinz Guderian, the father of mechanized warfare in Nazi Germany. To understand the devastating impact of blitzkrieg, we must rewind to a Europe still haunted by the memory of World War I. That conflict had been one of stagnation trenches stretching across miles, battles won by inches, and casualties counted in the hundreds of thousands. Generals ordered charges into machine gun fire. Progress was measured in feet. It was a war that bled nations dry. Guderian watched that war and saw what was wrong: the lack of speed, of coordination, and above all, the refusal to evolve. In the interwar years, Guderian began to reimagine warfare not as a slow grind, but as a fluid, dynamic operation. He read the works of British military theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Liddell Hart, who had argued for mechanized warfare and the power of mobility. But while the world debated theory, Guderian built a reality. He believed that the future of war belonged to those who could move faster, strike harder, and keep their enemies off balance from the very first hour. When Hitler came to power in the 1930s, Guderian's vision found its moment. Germany, still limited by the Treaty of Versailles, had been quietly rearming, and now, under the Third Reich's aggressive expansionism, Guderian was given the freedom and the resources to test his ideas. The result would shake the foundations of Europe. In 1939, as dawn broke over Poland, Guderian's armored divisions surged forward. They were not scattered, unsupported units. They were synchronized machines, with tanks leading the charge, motorized infantry securing flanks, artillery softening targets, and Luftwaffe aircraft crippling enemy strongholds ahead of the advance. Roads were seized before defenders could react. Communication lines were severed. Resistance was overwhelmed, not by sheer numbers, but by tempo. By the time the Polish army realized what was happening, The spearheads were already behind their lines, encircling them, shattering their ability to regroup. This was blitzkrieg in action. And it worked. The world took notice. In the spring of 1940, the Germans unleashed the strategy again, this time in the West. France, still confident in its mighty Maginot Line, was stunned as German forces bypassed the fortifications through the Ardennes forest, a region thought impassable by tanks. It was not. Guderian's panzers pushed through with breathtaking speed. Within days, they had reached the English Channel, trapping Allied forces and forcing the desperate evacuation of over 300,000 troops at Dunkirk. France fell in 6 weeks, a country brought to its knees, not by superior numbers, but by momentum. And that was the terrifying brilliance of blitzkrieg. It was not just a military tactic, it was a psychological weapon. Armies were not just defeated, they were disoriented, disorganized, and demoralized. Commanders lost control, communications collapsed. Entire divisions surrendered without a real fight, simply because they had no idea where the enemy was or where they would strike next. At the center of this whirlwind stood Guderian, often at the front lines with his men, coordinating movements by radio, adjusting tactics in real time. He treated tanks not as blunt instruments, but as surgical tools used to puncture, to surround, to slice through the enemy's command structure and nerve system. His genius lay in seeing the battlefield not as a series of front lines, but as a living, moving organism. And his goal was simple: sever the spine. But as with many German innovations during the war, blitzkrieg's early brilliance masked deeper flaws. It relied on tight logistics, rapid resupply, and effective communication. When those systems broke down, especially in the vast stretches of the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, the Blitz stalled. And once the enemy adapted, learning to absorb the shock and counterattack its flanks, the tactic lost much of its initial edge. Guderian himself would grow increasingly frustrated with Hitler's interference. He argued for strategic withdrawals, flexible lines, and mobile defense. Hitler demanded no retreat, turning fluid strategy into static orders. In late 1941, Guderian was dismissed after clashing with high command, his vision abandoned just as the Eastern Front demanded exactly what he had pioneered: adaptability and speed. Yet even in failure, blitzkrieg left its mark. The Allies, slow to understand its power at first, began studying it closely. The American concept of air-land battle, Soviet deep battle doctrines, and NATO's fast maneuver warfare all owe something to Guderian's theories. The wars of Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq would use variations of blitzkrieg tactics, proof that speed, coordination, and combined arms had become the blueprint of modern warfare. But it is important to remember what blitzkrieg was and what it was not. It was not just tanks racing across plains or planes screaming overhead. It was an idea, a belief that war could be won not by who had more, but by who moved faster, who thought smarter, and who struck first. And like all powerful ideas, it could be used for liberation or for conquest. In the hands of Nazi Germany, it became a weapon of aggression. In later decades, it would evolve into a doctrine of deterrence and rapid response. Guderian's legacy, like the war itself, is complex. He was a brilliant strategist, but also a servant of a brutal regime. His tactics revolutionized the battlefield, even as they served a cause built on expansion and oppression. The blitzkrieg did not win the war for Germany, but it changed how wars would be fought forever. Today, when armored columns roll across a desert, when drones coordinate with jets and infantry in real time, or when a nation's army advances in synchronized harmony, you are seeing the echoes of Guderian's lightning war. Not just in steel and fire, but in speed, in shock, and in strategy. Beneath the waves, where sunlight fades into darkness and silence reigns, another war was raging, a war that did not roar like tanks or scream like rockets, but whispered through sonar and struck with the sudden fury of a torpedo. As German tanks thundered across Europe and jet fighters scorched the skies, the Atlantic Ocean became the deadliest battlefield of them all. It was here, in the icy depths, that Germany launched its most relentless assault on Allied lifelines using a weapon as quiet as it was deadly, the U-boat. The term U-boat, short for Unterseeboot, struck fear into Allied sailors and convoy commanders alike. These submarines, stealthy and persistent, were not just military tools. They were instruments of strategy crafted to choke the British Isles and cut off the flow of supplies from America. And at the center of this effort was the Type 7, the workhorse of the German Kriegsmarine, sleek and deadly, designed to operate far from home and return unseen. The idea was simple but terrifying. Instead of fighting armies head-on, starve them, sink their food, their fuel, their weapons, and their reinforcements before they even reached the battlefield. And it almost worked. In the early years of the war, the U-boat campaign surged with brutal effectiveness. German wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines roamed the Atlantic in search of convoys. Under the cover of night, they would surface, surround the slow-moving cargo ships, and strike with precision. One torpedo, well placed, could send thousands of tons of steel, ammunition, or grain to the ocean floor in minutes. And sometimes it was not just supplies. Entire crews, hundreds of men, would vanish without a trace. Among the commanders who became legends of this underwater war was Otto Kretschmer, the most successful U-boat ace of the conflict. Known for his cool precision and daring tactics, Kretschmer sank over 270,000 tons of Allied shipping, often surfacing at night to finish his kills with the deck gun. To Allied convoys, he was a phantom. To the German propaganda machine, he was a hero. But to the families of lost sailors, he was the shadow of death on the sea, and the numbers were staggering. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping. That is over 700 ships in a single year. Some convoys suffered catastrophic losses, ships exploding in fireballs, crews leaping into freezing water, rescue ships unable to help for fear of being sunk themselves. But this war beneath the sea was never one-sided. The Allies, alarmed and desperate, began pouring resources into anti-submarine warfare. Sonar systems improved, escort carriers were deployed, convoys became more heavily guarded, aircraft with depth charges patrolled the skies. And most importantly, codebreakers at Bletchley Park began intercepting and deciphering the Germans' encrypted messages. The famous Enigma machine, once thought unbreakable, was now giving away the U-boat's positions. Slowly, the tide began to turn. From late 1943 onward, the U-boat campaign lost momentum. German submarines were being hunted and destroyed at a staggering rate. Every patrol became a gamble. Submariners, once seen as the elite of the German Navy, now faced the grim reality that they were on suicide missions. By the end of the war, 3 out of every 4 U-boat crewmen never came home. Over 30,000 died in the deep. The cold sea became their grave. And yet, even in desperation, Germany sought innovation. As the Allies adapted, so did the Kriegsmarine. Out of the chaos of defeat came a vessel years ahead of its time. The Type 21, known as the Electroboot. Unlike earlier U-boats, which spent most of their time on the surface and only submerged to attack or hide, the Type 21 was designed to live underwater. With a streamlined hull, quiet electric motors, and a revolutionary snorkel system that allowed it to run its diesel engines while submerged, it could stay hidden longer and strike harder. It was the first true submarine of the modern era, a ghost that could glide silently beneath destroyer screens and launch torpedoes without ever being seen. Had it entered service earlier, the course of the war in the Atlantic might have shifted again. But it came too late. Only a few Type 21s ever saw action. Most were captured or scuttled before they could make an impact. Still, their legacy was profound. After the war, Allied nations, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, rushed to examine captured Type 21 boats. They became the blueprint for Cold War submarine development. The silent arms race beneath the sea had been born in German shipyards, but the human cost was immense. For the men who served aboard U-boats, the war was not about ideology, it was about survival. Days in the Atlantic meant cramped quarters, stale air, the constant creaking of hulls, and the terror of sonar pings followed by explosions. Death could come in seconds, a crack in the hull, a depth charge too close, a torpedo in return. And when it came for all of them. U-boat crews had one of the highest mortality rates of any unit in the entire war. Their courage, however misguided their cause, is undeniable. They fought in darkness, with little recognition, against increasingly impossible odds. And they left a permanent scar on the naval history of the world. In the grand symphony of Nazi Germany's military might, from the Me-262 jet streaking across the sky to the Tiger tank crushing enemies on land, the U-boat was the haunting baseline, steady and menacing, echoing from the depths. It was not seen, but it was always felt. A reminder that in war, sometimes the most devastating threats do not march or fly. They swim silently below, waiting to strike. And while the U-boats failed to strangle Britain or force a surrender, they succeeded in proving that no part of a war is ever truly safe, not even the vast, cold, endless ocean. Before the world ever saw the blitz of tanks rolling across borders or rockets soaring into the stratosphere, the roar of engines in the sky had already announced the coming storm. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's aerial fist, was not just an accessory to the Nazi war machine, it was its vanguard, with its dive bombers screaming from the heavens and its nimble fighters sweeping the skies. Germany's Air Force set the tone for World War II, delivering terror and tactical precision in equal measure. At the heart of this airborne dominance was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, a name that would forever be etched into the memories of those who lived beneath its shadow. The Stuka was not just a bomber. It was a psychological weapon. Its signature siren, the Jericho trumpet, wailed as it dove vertically toward its target, a sound engineered to unnerve enemies and civilians alike. Imagine being a soldier in a trench or a mother fleeing with her child as that high-pitched screech echoed from above. Seconds later, earth-shaking explosions followed. The dive was near vertical, and its accuracy unmatched at the time. German engineers had given birth to the first truly effective tactical bombing aircraft, but the Stuka was not a lone predator. Escorting it through hostile skies or battling enemy fighters head-on was another icon of the Luftwaffe, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. Sleek, fast, and deadly, the Bf-109 was a symbol of German engineering and aggression. It was flown by the best Germany had to offer pilots, whose skill and kill counts turned them into living legends. Take Erich Hartmann, for instance. Nicknamed the Black Devil by Soviet pilots, Hartmann became the most successful fighter ace in history, credited with a staggering 352 aerial victories. He was not just a man in a cockpit, he was a force of nature, a pilot whose instincts, precision, and fearlessness made him a nightmare to the enemy and a hero to his comrades. Or Adolf Galland, the charismatic leader of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Galland was not just known for his sharp skills in combat, he was also famous for his clashes with high command. When Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, demanded more from his squadrons during the Battle of Britain, Galland famously replied that what he really needed were a squadron of Spitfires. It was a bold statement, but it showed Galland's respect for the enemy and his willingness to speak truth in a military hierarchy that punished dissent. In the early years of the war, especially during the invasions of Poland, France, and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe performed with breathtaking efficiency. It was not just the hardware, it was the doctrine. The Luftwaffe had mastered the art of close air support, working hand in hand with ground forces to annihilate enemy resistance before it could organize. This was the aerial component of blitzkrieg, and it was devastating. During the Battle of France in 1940, Luftwaffe squadrons cleared the skies of enemy aircraft, bombed bridges, roads, and rail lines, and isolated Allied units from one another. The coordination between dive bombers, fast-moving panzer divisions, and relentless infantry advances created a tempo of war that left traditional armies gasping. Airfields were destroyed before Allied planes could take off. Columns of retreating soldiers were hunted from above. Communication lines were severed, not by saboteurs on the ground, but by bombs from the air. This combination of technical innovation, pilot skill, and strategic doctrine turned the Luftwaffe into one of the most feared forces in the world. But even this powerhouse had its weaknesses. The Luftwaffe, despite its early triumphs, was designed as a tactical air force, not a strategic one. Its aircraft were optimized for supporting ground troops, not for long-range bombing campaigns. When Hitler turned his gaze across the English Channel, demanding the Luftwaffe break British resistance through bombing alone, cracks began to show. The Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 became a turning point. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced an opponent with superior radar, formidable aircraft like the Spitfire and Hurricane, and pilots fighting with their backs against the wall. British cities and airfields were bombed relentlessly, but the RAF did not break. The Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses in pilots and aircraft, and without air superiority, Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's planned invasion of Britain, was abandoned. Still, the Luftwaffe adapted. In the east, during Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe once again proved its strength, decimating thousands of Soviet aircraft in the first few days. But the vastness of the Soviet Union, combined with harsh winters and ever-improving enemy defenses, began to strain its capabilities. As the war dragged on, Germany's production could not keep pace with the Allies. Resources dwindled, fuel shortages grounded planes, and the quality of replacement pilots could never match those lost. Even so, the spirit of innovation did not die. In the late stages of the war, the Luftwaffe fielded the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, a game-changing aircraft that could outrun and outgun any Allied plane. But by then it was too little, too late. The skies that once belonged to the Eagle were now filled with Allied bombers, escorted by long-range fighters, day and night. Yet the legacy of the Luftwaffe's early dominance endures. Its tactics shaped the air doctrines of nations for decades. Its aircraft, especially the Bf-109, became blueprints for future designs, and its pilots, both the celebrated and the fallen, left behind a complex story of brilliance and brutality, of courage and complicity. In the grand narrative of Nazi Germany's war machine, from its panzer divisions to its stealthy U-boats, the Luftwaffe was its swift, sharp spear. It opened campaigns, shattered defenses, and delivered terror from above. And though its dominance would fade, its impact on the history of air warfare remains permanent. As we look back, it is worth remembering that the battles of World War II were not only fought on land or beneath the sea, but also in the vast, unforgiving sky, where men with wings carried the fate of nations in their hands. While the thunder of panzer tanks and the scream of dive bombers may dominate the imagination when we think of Germany's military machine in World War II, the reality is more complex and perhaps more impressive, because behind every tank that broke through a defensive line, every U-boat that lurked beneath the Atlantic, and every Me-262 that streaked across the sky, there was a vast, humming engine of logistics that kept it all moving. And at the heart of this unseen force was a modest but vital machine, the Opel Blitz. To the casual observer, the Blitz was nothing more than a truck. But in war, the most unassuming tools often prove the most essential. Designed as a 3-ton cargo carrier, the Blitz became the backbone of the Wehrmacht's supply chain, carrying everything from ammunition and fuel to rations, spare parts, and wounded soldiers. Without it, the famed German momentum, the fast, fluid style of warfare known as blitzkrieg, would have stalled in the mud. Germany's early victories were not only won with steel and fire, but also with mobility. The Wehrmacht did not merely move, it flowed, crossing borders, rivers, and mountain ranges with astonishing speed. The secret to this momentum was not just superior tactics or weaponry, it was an efficient, well-coordinated logistics system, and the Blitz was its workhorse. It could be produced quickly, repaired easily, and adapted into countless variations: ambulances, command vehicles, mobile kitchens, radio stations, and even anti-aircraft platforms. It was the German Army's Swiss Army knife. Imagine the Eastern Front in 1941, a theater of war stretching thousands of kilometers, from the forests of Poland to the steppes of Ukraine. German divisions moved relentlessly eastward, outpacing their supply trains, pushing deeper into Soviet territory. It was here that the Opel Blitz proved its worth. While trains required rails, and rails could be bombed or sabotaged, the Blitz could adapt, navigating rough roads and makeshift trails to keep frontline units stocked and moving. In many cases, when fuel depots were destroyed or railway lines severed, it was the Blitz that made the difference between retreat and continued advance. And it was not just supplies. The Blitz also carried communications. Literally, mobile radio command trucks allowed frontline officers to coordinate with air support, artillery, and reinforcements. In blitzkrieg warfare, speed and communication were everything, and the Blitz turned static planning into mobile execution. Battles could shift in minutes, and decisions that once took hours now happened on the move. This logistical agility gave German forces an edge in the early years of the war. In Poland, France, and even the initial phase of Operation Barbarossa, they struck with a tempo the world had never seen. Opposing forces, still tied to slower systems of movement and rigid command structures, were overwhelmed not only tactically, but mentally. They could not keep up. But as the war dragged on, the logistical miracle began to crack. Germany had overreached. Supply lines now stretched thousands of kilometers across hostile territory. Roads turned to rivers of mud in spring, then froze solid in winter. Fuel grew scarce. Allied bombers relentlessly targeted factories and depots. And while the Blitz was reliable, it was not invincible. Mechanical failure, ambushes, and sheer exhaustion began to take their toll. The truck that once symbolized unstoppable movement now struggled just to keep up. By 1943, Germany was fighting a defensive war. Gone were the lightning offensives. Now the Blitz was used to reinforce faltering lines, retreat wounded soldiers, and scavenge what little could be salvaged. Supply convoys that had once raced across open fields now crept along under cover of darkness, hunted by partisans and strafed from the sky. The Blitz, once a symbol of confidence and control, had become a lifeline in an increasingly desperate struggle. Still, its importance never faded. German engineers continued to adapt the platform, even late into the war. Some Blitz variants were fitted with flak guns, forming part of Germany's mobile air defense. Others became makeshift armored vehicles, attempting to compensate for the lack of tanks. In a war defined by resource shortages and shifting battlefronts, the ability to reimagine existing tools became a necessity. And yet, the true strength of the Opel Blitz was never in its armor or armament, it was in its reliability. In a conflict filled with wonder weapons and experimental technology, the Blitz was a workhorse that got the job done. It may not have made headlines, but it made victory or survival possible. In retrospect, the brilliance of Germany's war effort was not just in creating the Me-262 jet or the V-2 rocket. It was in building a system where those tools could function, where fuel reached airfields, ammo reached tanks, and field hospitals could move with the front. War is not won with weapons alone. It is won with movement, supply, and coordination. And the humble Blitz made all of that possible even today. Historians studying Germany's early war successes often point not just to their tanks or tactics, but to their logistics. They were ahead of their time not just in firepower, but in how they supported that firepower. So the next time you picture World War II, do not just think of Tiger tanks or screaming dive bombers. Picture the Opel Blitz, bouncing down a dirt road, dust trailing behind it, packed with crates and barrels, keeping the machine of war alive. Because without it, the lightning strikes of Blitzkrieg would have been little more than a flash in the pan. In a war of might, it was this engine of mobility and support that kept the fire burning, even as the sky darkened and the tide began to turn. In the Great Shadow War that raged alongside the tanks, planes, and submarines of World War II, the most decisive blows were often struck not with bullets or bombs, but with information. And nowhere was this more evident than in the secret world of the Enigma machine, a device whose code was thought to be unbreakable and which, for a time, gave Nazi Germany a ghost-like advantage. Orders were sent, positions were relayed, and strategies were executed, all with a false sense of security that would eventually lead to devastating consequences. At first, the Enigma machine was the perfect weapon of secrecy. With billions of possible combinations and daily changing ciphers, it turned every German transmission into an unreadable puzzle for Allied ears. In the early phases of the war, from the lightning-fast advances of the Blitzkrieg to the silent stalking of U-boats in the Atlantic, this encryption gave Hitler's forces the edge. Enemy nations were left guessing, reacting a step too late, or making costly mistakes based on incomplete intelligence. It was as if the Third Reich was playing chess while the rest of the world was still figuring out the board. But that edge would not last forever. Unbeknownst to the Nazi high command, a small team of codebreakers hidden in the quiet English countryside was chipping away at their shield of secrecy. In the halls of Bletchley Park, mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and engineers worked around the clock, racing against time, with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. Among them was Alan Turing, whose brilliant mind and early computer design, known as the bomb, would become the key to unraveling Enigma's mystery. The breakthrough did not happen overnight. It took years of analysis, captured codebooks, and even daring raids to obtain critical information. But once Enigma was cracked, the tide began to shift. Suddenly, the Allies were not just reacting, they were anticipating. Convoys could be rerouted away from U-boat ambushes. German plans in North Africa could be disrupted. Even preparations for D-Day were influenced by decrypted messages. Entire battles, entire theaters of war began to turn on the hidden advantage of intelligence. This silent victory, known as Ultra, remained classified for decades. But many historians now believe it shortened the war by as much as 2 years, saving countless lives and altering the outcome of history itself. Germany's belief in the invincibility of its encryption had become a fatal blind spot, and it is here that the full picture of Germany's wartime machine, its weapons, strategies, and technologies comes into focus. Yes, Germany had the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, capable of leaving Allied aircraft in its contrail. Yes, it launched the revolutionary V-2 rockets, precursors to the space age. Yes, it fielded terrifying panzer divisions, perfected combined arms warfare, and terrorized the seas with Type 7 U-boats. Its engineers created night vision scopes, smart bombs, and advanced radar systems. Its trucks, like the Opel Blitz, kept the momentum going when all else faltered. Its Luftwaffe pilots became legends of the sky. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, a machine fine-tuned for domination. But for all its might, Germany's war effort lacked something crucial: resilience, in the face of innovation beyond its control. Where the Nazis built weapons, the Allies built networks. Where Germany tried to win through power, the Allies began to win through information, deception, and endurance. As the codebreakers of Bletchley Park cracked open Enigma's secrets, they did not just shift the balance of the war. They revealed the deeper truth that no machine, however advanced, is invincible when matched against human ingenuity and collaboration. In the final years of the war, the German war machine, so dominant at the start, began to crumble. Its tanks were outnumbered, its skies lost to Allied bombers, its subs hunted by sonar and depth charges. And with every intercepted message, every disrupted plan, the myth of Nazi invincibility faded further. The Enigma machine, once the symbol of impenetrable control, became a symbol of flawed overconfidence. And so as we close this journey through the powerful secrets of Nazi science and technology, we are left with a paradox. Germany's technological legacy shaped the post-war world. Its rockets laid the groundwork for space travel. Its jet designs influenced Cold War aviation, and its tactical doctrines reshaped modern militaries. Yet its story is also a cautionary tale of how innovation without ethics and power without wisdom can lead a nation to ruin. If this video helped you better understand the hidden layers of World War II, from the Me-262's roar to the silent brilliance of the Bletchley Park codebreakers, please give it a like, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that go beyond the battlefield. History is never just about battles and borders. It is about minds, machines, and the choices we make. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, even the most powerful machines can be undone by the quietest hands.